Understanding China has never been more important and more difficult. Takshashila's latest executive capsule course, Watching China, is an all virtual course that will help you decode China's politics and policies. Learn about the party state structure, ideology, and policy drivers. Master the language of Communist Party discourse and open source research. The course is perfect for professionals, journalists, students, or anyone curious about the Asian giant. Sign up now on the link in the description to start understanding China like never before.
Welcome to All Things Policy, a daily podcast by the Takshashila Institution. We are a bunch of policy nerds based in Bengaluru, and we like bringing fresh perspectives to Indian affairs and Indian perspectives to global affairs. So grab a cup of coffee, sit back, and join us for today's chat.
Hi everyone, I'm Sarthak and I welcome you to a new episode on All Things Policy. The state of India states typically tends to be in the news. There are usually long heated arguments on the north-south divide. In today's episode, we'll discuss some recent studies, analysis on the economic performance of Indian states. Broadly, we're going to look at a couple of studies. The first one is by Rajan Govil and Khyati Chauhan, Growth, Convergence and Public Finances of India and its States. So it looks at the data points from fiscal year 2000 to 2023 and how the states have performed in these two decades. Apart from that, there was another study, Relative Economic Performance of Indian States by Sanjeev Sanyal and Akanksha Arora. This study looks at a longer time horizon from 1960 to 2023-24. How has the trajectory been? So joining me for this episode is my colleague Rijesh. So we are going to talk about how India's different states have performed, what are some interesting patterns. Some of these studies also talk about what should the states do. So we'll also be discussing that. Hi Rijesh, welcome to All Things Policy.
Thank you, Sarthak. Okay, so what are we starting off with first?
Yeah, so how have the Indian states performed? What is your analysis?
Well, first let's talk about the paper by Rajan Govil and Khyati. So this was I found it to be quite an interesting paper. They've basically taken the period from 2002 to 2023, about 20 years, a fairly long period of time, and they've looked at revenue disparities across state, how has it moved out. Some interesting things that I think that I saw that the paper pointed out. One, of course, is that overall general government revenues are pretty much stagnated at 20% of GDP, right? So, which and whereas our expenditure has pretty much stagnated around 30% of GDP over that 2-3 decades that they've studied. Meaning that in general, India's had a fiscal deficit of close to 8.5-9.5% of GDP, and that's moved around a little bit, but broadly it stayed there. The implications of that is that you're always running a deficit, so generally you will not have enough resources for development and investment purposes. And so that's an interesting thing that straight away they've observed, and obviously they've also looked at it from a state level as opposed to just at overall India level, just to see if there are differences.
And one more thing that they talk about, in fact, they have premised their paper on this, right? Per capita incomes. They're trying to find out what has happened to the per capita income of these states.
Correct.
And they've also tried to analyze what has happened to the per capita income of the high income states, the middle income states and all. And they have basically plotted the long-term trend, right, over the 20 years, 2 decades period, right? What has been the growth rate and which states their per capita income has been higher than the long-term trend. And they find out that the high income states, they typically have grown at a faster rate. The lower income states, they have grown at a slower pace. In fact, among the higher income states, most of the states have grown at a higher growth rate, except for Punjab. Among the lower and the middle income states, most of them have not grown at a very fast pace, but here Odisha stands out. It stands as an exception. It has grown at a much faster pace. And again, as I mentioned, Punjab, a higher income state, not growing well. In fact, this is something that also is reflected in the other paper by Sanjeev Sanyal. So this is how the overall trajectory looks like. Now, this paper also talks about what needs to be done, and it identifies that.
Before we go there, I just wanted to just if we can just move back to theory a little bit, right? The reason why this finding is interesting is because the neoclassical model of growth, so the solo model as it's called, it predicts that over time in a country, levels of real per capita income across regions in a country should converge. With a rather important assumption that there is no restriction on the mobility of labor or capital or region within that country. So that's why this finding is important, that the high income states have grown at a higher than average real per capita GDP, and low income states have grown lower, because clearly that finding is against what you would expect from a neoclassical model.
At least the model,
theoretical
have, right?
model that you would expect.
In fact, we'll come to the model and again whether it makes sense, what could be the reason why there is a deviation. But before that, Sanjeev Sanyal paper also looks at the different states in India, and it also has some interesting findings. For example, the southern states, right? They have grown at a faster pace. Their share in the GDP is substantial, has increased massively, especially after the liberalization. At this point of time, they contribute around 30% to India's GDP. Apart from that, their per capita income proportional to the nation's per capita income is also quite high. So this is something which is interesting, and usually all these debates about sharing of resources, finance commissions, formula for devolution, right? All these things are in the news, and typically the southern states, this is their main argument, that we are the ones who are contributing to the economy more. We should get a larger, we should get more things in return, more resources in return. So again, clearly this trend also reflects that. Apart from that, the western states, Maharashtra, Gujarat, Goa, they have also done well.
Yeah.
Their contribution to the GDP has been on the rise, and also their per capita income tends to be higher than the nation's per capita income. Now, what I found really interesting was the trajectory of Punjab and Haryana. At some point of time, they were same state, and both have been through similar circumstances, Green Revolution and all those things. But Punjab's contribution to the GDP has declined. Punjab's per capita income relative to the nation's per capita income has declined. It's lower than a nation's per capita income. That's something which is interesting. On the other hand, Haryana has actually done well. It's one of the most prosperous states. When it comes to West Bengal, again another cause of concern. Right here, also the per capita income has been declining, and as we were discussing some time back, Odisha stands out. Odisha, again, its per capita income is lower than the nation's per capita income, but it has been on the rise. Recently, it has been on the rise. So that's a green shoot, so as to say. So this is how it looks like. And UP, Bihar, again, seem to be a cause of concern. The per capita incomes tend to be quite low.
Yeah.
Sanjeev Sanyal,
in fact, Odisha is interesting because even over a 20-year time frame, if you look at middle income states, the growth rate of the CAGR for per capita real income over a 20-year period is well above the trend line. It's almost 7%, which is as good as Kerala or Andhra, Haryana, a lot of states. Only Gujarat and Tamil Nadu have done better than Odisha, which is quite impressive actually. Over such a long period to sustain such outperformance is fantastic.
Yeah. But yeah, the Sanjeev Sanyal's paper, it does not have any policy prescriptions as such. Correct. But it does provide all these data points, while the other paper does have some policy prescriptions as well. So, coming to the next bit here, I mean, since we are aware of the performance of the states, now, the Rajan Kovil's paper prioritizes or focuses a lot on convergence, right? The idea here is, in any country, over a period of time, if you do not have any restrictions on the mobility of labor, capital, right? So, in such a scenario, there should be convergence. All the regions will have similar per capita income. This is what it talks about, and this is based on certain economic models. Now, Rijesh, what do you think about this?
So that I think is the one part of the paper that I seriously I was not able to quite get on board with. I mean, I understand the assumption from the perspective of what they're trying to show in the paper, But I mean, and they are very clear to say that this is that there is no regulatory barrier to the movement of. So they are not talking about other kinds of barriers. But if you look at it from a practical perspective, in any country, not just India, there will be some barriers to movement of technology or capital or labor. Those could be social barriers. You are wedded to your land and your family is there, whatever it is. Capital will always move to places where there is demand, where there is a market.
There is higher rate of return.
And there is a higher rate of return available. And technology, increasingly now, if you look at technology, because of network effects, technology is likely to pop up and be available more in places where there is already a network. Like, for example, Bangalore is a great example of a place where you will have far better access to technology than some place that is not Bangalore. It's very tough for another Bangalore-like hub to come up in India very easily, right? So because of that, I think this assumption itself that there is free movement of labor, capital and technology is not, I'm not sure that I agree with that. So if you take that assumption out, then I really don't see how you can expect to see convergence in per capita income. And that's one. And the second, of course, is the point that we've also discussed separately, that should we even target convergence within the context of a country? Like, how far should you say that states should converge? Could you then argue that no, districts should converge? And if you keep going down,
just before that, I want to add one thing. You mentioned about capital and technology, right? But another component here is labor.
Correct.
Right. So again, if you look at mobility of labor, I mean, though the constitution says that you can move from one place to another, you can practice, profess, whatever, right? So you can carry out any occupation. But in reality, that might not be true because many states will have different kinds of domicile requirements. And not just that, there are cultural factors at play, right? So you might not be welcome in some states, or there might be riots and those kind of things based on languages. We have seen that in the past. I think Professor Chinmay Tumbe also documents some of these things. So mobility of labor is not as easy as we think about to a large extent. So that also is another restriction. You cannot just move from one place to another.
Correct. And that's also linked in some sense to skill sets.
Yeah,
which is actually touched upon in the paper later on in the recommendations. Clearly, the assumption that labor can move freely implies that the skill sets are available across uniformly, and that's clearly not true. Like if you look at the educational resources available across states, they're not the same.
Not the same, yeah.
So therefore, skill sets will not be the same, which has an impact on the ability of labor to move. I think that is one of the major reasons why it's not easily available in India.
And then you have these anti-migrant sometimes.
Correct. I mean, those are all cyclical political economy things that come and go, and they will have their impacts on it.
Now, since you're talking about the other aspect, right, should we even seek to have some form of convergence? And so we can look at it at multiple levels, right? In this particular paper, he says that one of the goals should be to ensure balanced development. That means all places should have equal levels of development. And the analysis is on the basis of state incomes. Now, yeah, I mean, maybe that is one level at which you are trying to ensure equal level of development. That means state A, state B, state C, they are all having equal per capita income. But again, why should that be just the level, right? You should maybe approach it in a more granular way. Every district should have same income levels. Then even if you go at a slightly granular level, then you will say, okay, all households should have equal per capita income.
Exactly,
right?
yeah. So
again, it doesn't really make sense why you should be trying to do that. But there is another angle also, right? Whether this is something which makes economic sense, right? If you look at different kinds of economic principles, again, convergence might be violating some of the ways by which some of these things work. As you were mentioning, a city like Bangalore, right? There are different kinds of urban agglomeration effects at play. If you are clustering, or if you have certain economic activities in one place, then you will have clusters around it, and again, that particular place will contribute more to the economy. The other places will not contribute, and other places also tend to benefit because of the clustering that is happening in a particular place.
correct.
Right. So anything else that you can think of?
Yeah, so I mean, I would say that, rather than seeking convergence, what I would say is, and I think the Sanyal paper does a better job of it, the more important thing is that all regions are generally moving in the right direction. So one thing that the Sanyal paper looks at is what was the relative per capita income in 2002 and 2023, for example, right? Or 2012 and 2023. And as long as that number is going up, so Odisha is still in 2023-24, the per capita not per capita income, per capita state GDP relative to India is only 88%, but it's come up from about 40% to 80%. So they're moving in the right direction. And I think that's what, it should not be that everybody should converge to the same goals, right? It's that everybody's standard of living is improving.
Yeah.
The GDP in the state is improving. Like you said, Bangalore or Karnataka may be doing some things as a result of which its overall growth rate may be higher. The attempt should not be to try and see if Bihar can become Karnataka, but that Bihar's relative contribution to income should be going up, their standards should be slowly going up, their per capita income should be going up. Whether they do it the same way or by a different way is not really relevant, I think.
Yeah. And also, it should not be the case that Karnataka should do less of something.
Correct.
And Bihar should do more of.
That's another important thing. That
it should not be the case that Karnataka
you could
grows.
converge by bringing Karnataka to Bihar rates of growth, but obviously that's not
That
what
is not
anybody's
something which
looking
is ideal. And so again, the idea of convergence itself, I was not very sure whether it makes sense here. Now, the paper also talks about some ways by which things can be improved, right? So it says that more or less the other things are are uniform or constant monetary policy and other things. So it is possibly the fiscal policy that should be prioritized here, right? So how we approach different states through fiscal policy, that is something that can be taken care of. What do you think? What should be the right approach for different states in India?
Well, I mean, I can't off my head think of a right approach, but I think what the paper does show, right, is it does show, for example, that in terms of revenue development expenditure or capital expenditure, even states like Bihar and Uttar Pradesh are spending quite well in 2023 as opposed to 2002. Where in 2002, say Uttar Pradesh or Bihar were well behind Haryana, Punjab, Karnataka, Maharashtra. Today they are all spending well enough, but they at the same time are not spending quite as much on the larger states or the better off states on, say, healthcare, education, right? Which to me was interesting. I mean, I don't know the answer to this, but it is a question in my mind as to what should they be focused on today? Should they be building physical infrastructure or should they be investing in soft infrastructure like healthcare and education? And I don't have a good answer to that. So,
yeah, but it need not necessarily be either or as well, right? I mean,
no, it is never either or. You need both. But the fact is that it appears that they, at least from the paper, it appears that they spend more on physical infrastructure than they do on, say, non-tangible infrastructure like healthcare and education. And I don't know if that is the right allocation. One might argue that you need roads before you need better healthcare and education. One may argue the other way around. I don't know the right answer.
And see, one way to look at it is what the state should be doing. But at the same time, there is, I think, a role of union government in all these things.
Correct.
Right. So, and given that union government has typically higher resources, and we were discussing this, right? The states do not have enough resources, and union government, because of the way Constitution assigns revenue functions, the union government has larger pool of revenue which it needs to distribute with the states. And this is what has happened, happens, and the Finance Commission also comes into picture here. Now, one way to think of it is there are certain goods which are public in nature. These are the public goods, right? And then there are certain kinds of goods which have meritorious components, which have positive externalities. And these are the things which play a very significant role. Maybe you have different per capita incomes, but if all places have at least basic level of these things, public goods, for instance, law and order, or meritorious goods, health, education, and all those things, right? Infrastructure again will be part of it. If all places have some bare minimum level of these things, it should not be a problem. You don't need any convergence, but some basic levels of these things should be there throughout. And it is herein where the union government can play a role. Right? For instance,
So I would argue that the union government is, I mean, I think, at least I could be mistaken, but if I'm not mistaken, the capital expenditure numbers in that paper for Uttar Pradesh, Bihar, that also shows, includes the grants that they get from the center. So, the fact that
Yeah.
Uttar Pradesh and Bihar is among the largest spenders on capex, I think is indicative of the fact that they're also getting grants and catching up to the rest of
definitely,
India.
definitely.
So it's not necessarily a negative thing. It's
Yeah.
just that it was a question in my head.
Yeah, definitely. So the thing is, the way some of these things are done presently, right? How do you ensure that you have basic healthcare facilities, education facilities? Mostly it is done through the centrally sponsored schemes. Now, it has, again, in these schemes, the union will be providing some resources to the states, but the states also have to contribute their share. Now, many states, especially the poor states, the lower income states, they do not have enough resources to match whatever they're getting from the union government. And again, the allocation of these resources is not necessarily linked to the current levels of services. Some states might require more. Those who have even poor health outcomes, poor education outcomes, they don't have basic infrastructure in place. They will require more. But again, you don't have provisions for that. So if the here again the union government has a role to play, maybe it can have provisions, instead of having these many centrally sponsored schemes, maybe reduce it, rationalize it, and have some sort of open-ended matching transfers that will enable the states to maybe invest more, improve the levels of services.
Yeah, correct. I agree with that. I actually think that in places like healthcare and education, the center should look to devolve and move more funds to the state, because each state has its own need.
Requirements.
The needs of Kerala in healthcare are very different from UP because the demographics are very, very different, right? Or in education for that matter.
Yeah, and all these things have a bearing on per capita incomes,
yeah. So
right?
I mean, I think these are two definitely the areas where states need to make their own decisions on what is required, and imposing central schemes or centrally sponsored schemes that have some sort of standardized template that everybody needs to sign up for is not a good idea for a state with as diverse characteristics as India.
And again, the states will have higher requirements because their spending obligations are more, right? So how do you ensure that they have that freedom to spend on things which matter more to them? So one option is have higher union devolution to the states, right? Currently it is 41%. So whatever union gets taxes that from the divisible pool, 41% is shared with the states. While if you look at the expenditure responsibilities of the states, almost more than 60% of the expenditure obligation is carried by the states, right? So somewhere this gap has to be bridged. The union transfer has to increase further. So these are things which can ensure that each place has bare minimum level of services, which can possibly help increase people's per capita income. Maybe people will find a job over there, or it will at least make them capable to move to other places where you have economic opportunities. Anything else, Rijesh?
And the only other thing that I really found a slightly worrying as a Malayali was that Kerala and Punjab are the two states where what he calls non-development expenditure, right, which is fixed, like things like pension and subsidies. They are close to 100% of the state's own revenue in Kerala and over 100% in Punjab, so which is sort of scary. Basically, what it means is both these states need government grants to just function or even invest anything. Thankfully, no other big state is in that kind of a situation, so that is good. Maybe Bengal is. So that's not a good sign for any state to be in a situation where your fixed payments are almost 100% of your revenue. That's a terrifying sign, to be honest. But all those states need to do something about it.
Yeah, so the different states have these committed spendings, right? So they can't shy away from it. They have to make
those payments, and it's only going to get worse, right?
Yeah, ideally it should. The ratio of committed spendings to the total revenue received, it should ideally decrease. It should not be increasing. If it is increasing and if it is this high, then it is a major cause of concern.
But I mean, the paper has not said anything about how one can decrease that. But I guess that was not their intent. But do you have any thoughts on that?
FRBM laws are in place. You have to
but
check that.
the fiscal responsibility, none of the states are doing all that badly from a fiscal deficit perspective. They were all around 3.5% of, which is their 3% is their goal. They are at about 3.5%. Most of that is shot up during pandemic, and it hasn't actually come down to 3%. They've not managed to, which just reflects the fact that we haven't fully recovered from that shock.
That can be there, but apart from that, some states also, for instance, right, the kind of things which have been in the news. We have had some reforms, for instance, pension reforms.
Yeah.
But there are some states which have reverted to old pension scheme. So if you are reverting to old pension scheme, then your spending obligations are going to increase in the future. So try not to have those kind of measures. Try not to have wasteful subsidies. Spend more on capital expenditure. Try to reduce your revenue expenditure part. And one thing, again, there's something which India doesn't have at this point of time. Many other economies, some 40 economies have it. Independent financial institutions, for instance, a fiscal council. These are institutions which are typically autonomous. They have operational autonomy, and they are the ones who review, monitor the spendings of the governments. They do costing of budgetary proposals, and since they don't, since they have that operational autonomy, generally they report to the legislature, and they come up with reports about whatever the government is spending or is planning to spend, how much, what will be the output of that, what is going to be the social productivity of all these things. These kind of things, if it is there, then you will debate, discuss, and hold the governments accountable, right? They cannot just go on spend on some random things. So these are things which we don't have right now. Some 40 economies already have. Maybe this is something that we can think of in the future.
How does a fiscal council differ from a finance commission?
Finance commission just decides, right, how the
Devolution
happens, right? What should be the formula? How much of the divisible pool should be shared with the states, and again within the states what sort of allocation will be there, and apart from that some grants and all, some conditions they will talk about, but they are not doing any analysis. Let's say the union government came up with a budgetary proposal. It's saying that, okay, we are going to spend money on health sector, this much we have to spend, and this is how it is going to be spent. They're not going to say whether this is wasteful or whether this is going to have this much output. A fiscal council does both the analysis before the budgetary proposal and after that also. Again, depends on the mandate. Some countries it will be only after the thing has been implemented. In some cases it does before as well. So these things Finance Commission doesn't do. Okay. And again, Finance Commission will be formed just once in 5 years, right? And it gives its recommendations, and then they just leave, right? So this is the fiscal council is not like that. It is a permanent body, provides continuous support. So maybe this is some thing that India needs to take up.
Yeah. Sarthak, one question I had was, the paper kind of shows that India's tax buoyancy is slightly over 1 over the last 3 decades. So that means that as we have better revenue realization for the government, which is currently at about 20% of GDP, and it's actually lower than the average for middle income countries. If we improve the revenue realization for the government, it will also improve our tax outcomes, which is good. So we'll have more money to spend. So what I wanted to ask you is, what are good ways for the government to do that?
Yeah, so if you look at government revenues, right, there are primarily 2 kinds of revenue. One is tax revenue and another is non-tax revenue. Now, non-tax revenue implies the different kinds of user charges, fees for the services that the government typically provides. Governments provide social services, economic services, different kinds of administrative services. Social service can imply, okay, they're spending on education, they're spending on healthcare, they're conducting exams somewhere, right? So these are all different services they provide. Economic service will be, government will be running different public sector units, or it will be providing irrigation facilities, or it will be engaged in some agriculture, horticulture services. So these are all different services, and for that also they can generate revenue, but for many of these things they don't generate enough revenue, they don't charge. So, and there are also some states which charge for this thing and they have done a good job. So as the first thing is, you should charge for things that you are providing for, right? And in some states they do charge, but the rates would not have been revised, right? Over the last 20 years, 30 years, they would not have revised it, right? So revise those prices. I would say only for those things which are public goods, only for those things which are meritorious in nature. For public goods, government should provide for it, don't charge it. But for those goods which are meritorious in nature, like positive externalities, finance it, subsidize it maybe. But for other things that you are providing for, please charge it. So that's one way. When it comes to tax revenue, typically tax revenue tends to be the bulk of the overall government revenue.
Right.
Now, in case of India, if you look at the tax policy, there are certain issues. For instance, our tax policy tries to do multiple things. It is used to promote, let's say, regional development. right? So tax rate somewhere will be something, somewhere it will be different. Or tax rates will be used to promote different sectors. It will be used to promote exports, bunch of things. Now, when this happens, it leads to base erosion, right? The base becomes smaller, the tax base. Now, instead of using tax policy for all these different kinds of objectives, use tax policy for one single objective, that is generating revenue. That way, tax evasion and all those things will get minimized. And if you want to promote exports and other things, there are other ways for that. You don't need to do this. Right? So, this is what one major thing that needs to be done. Keep in mind that tax revenue is a product of two things, tax rate into tax base. If the tax rates tend to be high, then again the tax base also gets reduced. So again, rationalize the tax rate as well. That increases the total tax revenue. Apart from that, there are reforms required when it comes to tax administration. Multiple committees have talked about it, the way the incentives are aligned. The morale of the tax administration, again, is always, it's said many committees have pointed out that it's not as high because they have to again report to generalist bureaucrats. So those kind of things are there. So again, these are the main major things which can possibly help augment tax revenues.
Okay. I also, I think briefly wanted to, maybe you could explain how they did this, but I think the case of Odisha is a very interesting case study to look at, right? Yes, it is a lot of their success is because they were able to successfully use their mining revenue, which is not exactly tax revenue, but they've sort of over 20 years, one of the best growth rates in per capita income. They've invested well. They have very good investment in public health, education. It's probably among the highest in India, I think, over that 20-year period. So this is an interesting case of a state that was lagging, that is not yet fully caught up, but has pretty much caught up in opposition to Punjab. So any lessons you think that...
So Rijesh, you are assuming that since I'm from Odisha, I know the answer.
No, you may not know the answer.
I don't know the answer.
Yeah.
But yeah, I know for sure that mining resources have contributed massively to Odisha's growth. In fact, it is one of the states which has exceptionally high quantum of non-tax revenues. But apart from that, I'm not sure about it. In fact, this is something which I would urge the listeners to maybe figure out.
Even Chhattisgarh and Jharkhand, I think, have good mining resources, right? So what has Odisha done differently that has allowed them to leapfrog both these states? Might be interesting to study, I think.
So this is something we would open to our audience. So you can always answer it in the comments. And apart from that, we'll share the link of both the papers along with this podcast. Rijesh, do you want to add something?
No, I think both interesting papers showing a slightly more nuanced view of, economic growth across states in India. I think the overall story is good. Most states have done well, the middle income, lower income states. There are some outliers. There are some obvious large states like Uttar Pradesh, Bihar that have lagged for a long time and are still lagging. But even there, I think the message I took away is good. They're at least their per capita expenditures and their revenue expenditures is going up, which is a good thing. There's nothing India needs more than an Uttar Pradesh and a Bihar that are starting to sort of catch up.
Yeah.
Because the impact of that on the rest of India will be massive if they start to catch up to the average. So,
exactly. And apart from that, I just have one point. States like Punjab, West Bengal, right? There's the reason for them to be concerned, especially Punjab, right? So maybe there should be greater analysis of the economics of Punjab. Where did it go wrong and what needs to be done better? With this, we will end this episode. Thanks, Rijesh, for joining. Thanks to the audience for listening to us.
Thank you.
If you liked our show, dive into Takshashila's research on technology, strategy, and economic affairs. Check us out at our Twitter handle @Takshashila INST or our website takshashila.org.in.